Hi, this is Dustin with Dustin's Dollars. Today I'm going to be talking about Tellurian, specifically about the U.S. Import and Export Bank. Sorry, let me turn my light on. There we go. Hopefully you can see me better. I'm going to be talking about the U.S. Export-Import Bank, what I've learned so far, and what that could mean for Tellurian. Before I begin, let me remind you that I am not a financial advisor or a financial professional of any sort. All opinions that I express in this video are mine and do not represent those of any company or any other individual. I currently hold a long position in Tellurian, so this video should be for your entertainment purposes only, because I could be wrong about everything I say in this video. You need to do your own research before making any investment decisions. So, spoiler alert, real quick, I do not have any super concrete conclusions about the U.S. Export-Import Bank and no inside information on what this could mean. I just wanted to share what I have learned so far. So, first of all, a couple weeks ago, or about actually more than a couple weeks ago, it's been almost 2 months at this point. Sharif Suki, in one of his Tuesday videos, talked about the U.S. Export-Import Bank, and and he said that they were, quote, looking at it as an additional option for financing, but he sort of said that it might be too slow for them because he effectively implied that they might close on their financing before on a timeline that was quicker than what the EXIM bank could possibly help them out with. So that was, I'll be honest, that and around that timeline, some of the articles were popping up about LNG and a recent change that the bank had made. Was the first time I ever actually heard about this U.S. Export-Import Bank. So that should give you at least some indication that I am most certainly not an expert here. But I wanted to dig deeper and understand what is it that changed and sort of form my own opinion on what this could mean for Tellurian, because it's not obvious to me that even if this doesn't have any impact on phase one, what could this mean for the future, for phase two and beyond? So, first of all, what changed? As I understand it, there is first an executive order by President Biden, this one in particular, from February 24th, about 2021, about supply chains and strengthening America's supply chains. And down the line, this eventually led the Export-Import Bank to decide to expand what they do to more domestic projects, meaning projects that are based in America that are going to plan to export some of what they produce. And I think they have a specific threshold of at least 25%. And I think that's even a lower threshold for certain industries. But that was the big change. That before this, they were focused on sort of facilitating some transactions and providing financing for specific exports. But I think the thing that changed, if I understand correctly, is that now they are extending this and they are more apt to give financing for domestic projects that might be performing exports in the future. And so what does this really mean for Tellurian? Is Tellurian a viable candidate for this, and more specifically driftwood? And if they are, how much could they possibly get? What would this mean for their financing terms? So I read through a fair bit of this. I think if you want to look for yourself, the relevant place to look is this Make More in America initiative on the exim.gov webpage. This, I think, is the program that is new and where they talk about this, and they say, just pulling out a couple of bullet points, they want the recommendation was to develop a proposal for the board considering whether or not EXIM should establish a new domestic finance program that would provide financing to support the establishment and or expansion of U.S. manufacturing facilities and infrastructure projects in the U.S. to facilitate U.S. exports, right? And so that's a bit duplicative of what I've already said. But then they also talk about a bit focusing this. They want to help companies make more in America, right? Getting back to the executive order and American supply chains, especially in sectors critical to national security. Energy, right? And so EXIM will make available the agency's existing medium and long-term loans, loan guarantees, and insurance to export-oriented domestic manufacturing projects. So from this and from some other things that I read through here, I do believe that Tellurian and Driftwood would make sense, would be eligible here, right? And this talks about the eligibility requirements. They enumerate some of them here, not all of them, but they talk about, here's that specific 25% export minimum threshold that they expect there. One of the other things, yeah, and I guess they just put one line in here that in addition to EXIM's standard due diligence procedures, they talk about this in other places where they expect to be repaid. And so they do actually do their due diligence to evaluate whether or not the project is going to be profitable enough to be able to pay back whatever money the Export-Import Bank loans to them. I think Tellurian, with contracts in hand and then obviously saleable commodity, it makes sense, and having it, all the project engineering and such at a point where it can progress. And so from that perspective, I think they are a likely candidate. Now, the one big question that I had, and this was part of why I want to do my own research here, is as part of the current administration, there's very much a push for renewables and green energy. And Tellurian, as much as you can, I think there is a logical argument to be made that I've talked about in the past, where LNG can be used to actually reduce carbon emissions by displacing coal. LNG in and of itself does emit carbon, right? There's no getting around that. It is a fossil fuel. And it's not clear to me if the Export-Import Bank would be willing to finance a project like the LNG exports, even in the face of, I mean, again, there's conflicting points of view, because this is what I was going to say, in the face of the potential benefits that this can bring to Europe to displace the Russian output of gas. So that's the factors, and I want to dig in a little bit more here. And so in the government, I would oftentimes go and, to try to divine what the answer to this would be, go look at who runs the agency. And the current chair, I guess you could just say, of the U.S. Export-Import Bank is this lady here, Retta Jo Lewis. Hopefully I pronounced her name correctly. And I read through her history. One thing that I did see here, and maybe this might be too small, maybe I can zoom in a little bit, is that in one of her recent roles before she joined before she was appointed to the U.S. Export-Import Bank, she had a role where she led the international efforts of U.S. state and local governments' cooperation towards and strategy regarding climate change. There's a whole bunch of these conferences here. Those are just abbreviations. And so that gave me a little bit of pause, that if she was very strongly on in a climate change role, that she might be against fossil fuels. And that made me a little bit worried. I know that because I actually read some of the initial press releases around this initiative, and there were other articles that tied it to LNG. But when I read what actually came out from the Export-Import Bank, none of it that I saw really highlighted LNG projects, right? There are other press releases from the Biden administration and other contexts saying, yeah, we absolutely want to support LNG exports to help our allies in Europe. But from what I saw from the Export-Import Bank, I didn't really see that. So I did some further research, and luckily there was a nice interview with the chair here, with Retta Jo Lewis. And this was from the 5th of May, 2022. So very recent. And she was specifically asked, let me find it here. Sorry, I scrolled away. That was not my smartest thing. Right here. Is there room for introducing incentives for green projects within the OECD arrangement? And what is the U.S. EXIM's current stance on oil and gas? So she said two very interesting things here. Number one, this is the very last line. As it relates to any industry or any sector, our charter totally mandates that we cannot discriminate against any industry, any sector, or company size. And I listened to another video where there were some other folks from the Export-Import Bank who talked about this, and they said, we did not discriminate against any industries. Of course, they all have to go through environmental reviews, but that they would actually even use some of the environmental impacts that came from other agencies if the project had already gone through that, as Tellurian has done, right? They went through this environmental review with the federal FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, I think it is. And so I have to imagine that would be sufficient for the U.S. Export-Import Bank if they've already gone through this with FERC. And luckily, she called this out specifically. She said, they do want to quicken the pace of transition from fossil fuels to renewables, but we recognize there are cleaner sources of these fuels. LNG, for instance, is a sector EXIM remains open to supporting. So that is clearly a positive indication that they would consider a project like Driftwood. So that's great. That made me much more confident that that could happen. And now it led me to the question of how much financing could this provide? And they have an oddly specific number. If you read through, and maybe I should zoom in here so you can see this a little bit better. An oddly specific number of how much funding they are willing to provide to these projects. And they measure it based off of how many jobs the project is going to create in the United States, because that is, as far as I can understand, one of their two objectives is to promote exports and to do so by creating American jobs. And so they measure this in job years, meaning that the number of jobs times the length of those jobs, which is really good for Driftwood, and I'll explain that in a second. Because this allows for up to $189,242 in financing per job year. And that's why I said it's an oddly specific number. I'm not quite sure how they came up with this, but it's there. And this is good for Driftwood because Driftwood will create some jobs over the long term, but it will create a lot of jobs to build the facility over, about a 3 or 4 year time span. So using this number, doing the calculation, Driftwood LNG, looking at their website, says they'll create approximately 6,500 construction jobs and then 400 operational jobs. So if I assume that those 6,500 construction jobs are going to happen over 4 years, that is 26,000 job years from the construction of Driftwood LNG. Phase 1, that is. This is all phase 1. And then those 400 operational jobs, if I look at that over a 10-year time span, assume that that's the length of whatever financing that the Export-Import Bank would provide to Tellurian, then that gives me another 4,000 job years. And so we're talking 30,000 job years. And so go back and look at that number and multiply by 189,242. And that gets us to, if I can look at these numbers properly, about $5.6 billion that the bank could potentially lend to Tellurian. So that is not quite enough for the full Driftwood phase 1, right? It's like half of what they would need. But it is a good chunk. And obviously they weren't going to get all of the money in the form of debt financing. That would actually even be a much larger portion of the debt. Now, the other interesting thing is you say, oh, well, that's great, but how does that actually help them? Even if they were to get it, let's say, obviously helps them to get the money. But my question here is it better for them to get it from the U.S. Export-Import Bank versus some other bank if they can do so? And from what I can tell, it doesn't seem like there is any particular benefits, because I found this other website, Holland Knight, seemed like they had some pretty good information here. I think this is also the organization that hosted, I watched you go look this up if you want to learn more. There's a whole hour-long Zoom call, basically, where they had a discussion between some of the Export-Import Bank employees talking about their policies and some of the details of this. But they say, okay, what is the pricing of this financing? And they basically come out here and say, look, we're trying to just do it at market prices. They look for direct market proxies if they have them, right? To the point where they even say they'll invest as part of a syndicate if possible. or they'll use credit default swaps to help price what it should cost to actually lend to the entity, to Tellurian in this case. Or if they can't find any of those ways to actually price the risk of lending to the project, then they'll come up. They have some other ways that they'll do this through, potential credit ratings. I actually didn't look in the details here because, Tellurian does have some publicly tradable bonds, and I think it's also reasonable they could potentially be, one bank as part of a larger syndicate that could provide the financing to Tellurian, and that the other banks could do the actual pricing of, what the rate is on that financing. So that I think is it. One other takeaway that I did get from the video with the export-import staff, the one that was put out by Holland and Knight, it was just available on YouTube. I'm pretty sure it's through Holland and Knight. If you search, it's you'll find it on YouTube. But one of the things they stated is, because there was a question that would say, hey, how long does this take? And they said, well, their goal is to provide at least effectively a preliminary response of a, yeah, this seems like we could do something and let's move forward, or a denial that this doesn't seem like it's really the right sort of project that we could fund, within 45 to 60 days. So, and another thing that I would say they stress there is that they are meant to step in when a project can't or is, for whatever reason, unable to get private market funding to make the project viable. And so a couple implications of that. Number one, with that 45 to 60 day time frame, the announcement from of the creation of this Make More in America initiative by the U.S. Export-Import Bank was on April 14th. So it's already been 45 days from then. Of course, even if Tellurian had wanted to pursue the U.S. Export-Import Bank's financing here, they would not have had an application ready as soon as the announcement was made, I assume. So, if you say, hey, maybe it took them 2 weeks to actually put in an application, that 45 to 60 day time frame would be starting about now and running through the end of June. So maybe we could potentially hear something if that is actually an option that Tellurian was exploring. And the other implication here might be, since they did stress that they are meant to step in when private market funding sort of isn't there for a project, even though for whatever reason they would believe that it should be, and that the project is important and should move forward, that maybe what needs to happen, or maybe not what needs to happen, maybe what could happen is, if Tellurian for whatever reason is not able to get the funding from the private market, maybe then they could take that as sort of evidence to the U.S. Export-Import Bank and say, look, we have this project. We even have, contracts to export the LNG in hand, but, we haven't been able to get the financing from banks. So, can you help us out, get this project up and running and get the financing going? So, again, pure speculation, but it's interesting that actually this might help reduce the risk that Tellurian doesn't get the financing, because it might be the case that this is more of a plan B, where if their primary options, for whatever reason, they're not able to close it, that falls through, maybe they could then take this to the U.S. Export-Import Bank and actually get the financing or get a large portion of it from them. Again, pure speculation. I don't know. I just wanted to, I have done some research in the past couple days, wanted to learn as much as I could about this in a quick period of time. And so I wanted to share it with all of you. So, let me know what you think down in the comments. I'd be super curious. I'm sure some of you know some things about this that I don't, as I'm always surprised by the quality of some of the feedback I get from you all. It's one of the reasons why I do this. So anyways, see, is there anything on the chat? Nope, not tonight. Thank you very much for watching. I appreciate it. If you ever are interested, I do these chats usually late in the evenings, Sunday through Thursday. I try to hit as many of those days as I can, at least. Late in Eastern US time, usually 10, 11, sometimes 12 p.m. like it was tonight. So anyways, thank you very much for watching. I appreciate it, and have a good one.